Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on nuclear-powered shipping. My name is Randall Krantz, and I am a Senior Advisor on Decarbonization at the Global Maritime Forum. And this webinar is part of a series of webinars that we've been doing on a range of different fuels and technologies related to decarbonization with the Getting to Zero Coalition. And so in this webinar, we're going to be talking about some of the very interesting angles of nuclear energy and the role of small modular reactors in shipping. And so our objective today is really to understand the potential role of small modular reactors, or SMRs, in shipping decarbonization and the implementation timeline. So this is going to be a 1-hour webinar. We've got a great panel with us, and the session, as you have heard, is being recorded. So we're going to be exploring a few different variables here, including cost drivers, safety issues, critical enablers for deployment. And as mentioned, we've got our panel. We have Mark Tipping, Director of Global Power to X for Marine and Offshore at Lloyds Register. We have Michael Beau, CEO Core Power, and the go-to option for SMRs. They're a technology provider. And we have Gwilym Stone, the Assistant Director of the UK Technical Ship Service Standards from the UK Coast Guard Maritime Agency. Before we dive into the content, what we'd like to do is have a better understanding of your familiarity with the technology and with the topic of shipping and nuclear. So if my colleague Rosa could go ahead and enable this quick poll, just 2 quick questions, very easy multiple choice. So how familiar are you with small modular reactors in shipping? And then if you scroll down, there's a second question, which is, what are the factors impeding exploration of this energy source for shipping decarbonization? So we'll just wait a few seconds to see how we get on that. Got about half the participants, 2/3. See if a few more are coming through. Okay, I think that's enough to be representative at least. So if we can share the results of that poll, there we go. So we can see that generally people have read and are interested in learning more. Everybody seems to have heard of this, and only a few are really working towards the solutions themselves. So that's, I think, kind of what we expected. And then on the hurdles and factors that are impeding this progress, it seems to be regulatory, environment, security, and safety were the top 2, though several people seem to have selected all of the above as well. Seems to be a little bit less concerned about the life cycle costs in the decommissioning. So hopefully we'll be able to explore some of those dimensions in a bit more detail, clear up any questions that you have. One important thing about this webinar is that it is interactive. So please ask us questions via the chat function. We will do our best to get to them. I will be directing questions to the speakers after they provide their opening remarks. So pop your questions in the chat and we'll direct those accordingly. And that should bring us to a very lively discussion over the next 55 minutes. So with that, I would like to turn to Mark Tipping of Lloyds Register to set the scene for us a little bit, followed by Michael Beau, and then finally Gwilym Stone. So Mark, over to you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Randall. Well, I've been asked to talk a little bit in the first instance about safety and how does a glass society approach this in the marine and offshore nuclear context. And obviously that brings us close to regulators as well. But our starting point in Lloyd's Register is actually that nuclear in the marine environment is not as novel or as new as it might first seem. It has its origins in the 1960s with vessels that did prove their technical capability. And for the last 50 years, reactors have been operated successfully and safely at sea in many of the defense forces of the world's navies. So the starting point here is not we're at zero. It's actually we have an awful lot of experience that has been built up by organizations, and perhaps even more importantly, when we look at safety in the nuclear context, people, because they're what actually drive the development of the standards and the regulations which we require and rely on so much in the development of the standards that we will be developing. Now, when we look at this, there are points of truth that we look to start with in identifying where safety starts. And beyond people and the experience gained, that points us to the International Atomic Energy Agency, whose principles have been adopted by all of the nations of the world operating nuclear facilities. So when we talk about bringing this into a classification context, we have to think about what has already been done before in both an onshore civil context and what has been happening in the marine context already. So that provides us with a very strong precedent of experience and material that has been generated. So we're not looking to invent new ships or reinvent new wheels when we're doing this. We're looking to learn about what has come before. Now, there is a new element here, and that is with the SMR technologies, which are very different to those employed in the defence sector. But the hazards and many of the challenges are very similar to what has already been addressed, which is why we'll keep coming back to looking at the experience that has been gained and the people that have that. So when we start looking at developing rules, firstly, it will be in conjunction with the regulators to whom we are all answerable, because they have to have buy-in to what we are doing. But we will also be looking at how do you license a nuclear reactor, noting there isn't experience for this in the maritime and the offshore sectors at this point in time. And then how do you interface that with the marine industry? Because the civil nuclear, marine and offshore industries are very different in their approaches and their structure at the moment. And one of the works in progress is to bring those pieces closer together so that the development of rules actually cover both sides in a holistic manner. Now, one approach which we're looking at is looking at the SMR as an island within the floating facility, contained within a box, and the floating structure around it as providing the protective environment for it. And of course, in a class context, as you'd expect, we have to look at all of those scenarios necessary to ensure the safety of that facility from external events and what can happen on a floating facility that in turn influences how it performs in the marine and offshore environment and providing the safety systems associated with it. So what we are doing is we are working with those proponents at the moment in the SMR sector who want to work in the marine and offshore spaces, but also interfacing with regulators and other bodies as well that are required, so that we develop a hierarchical structure of the requirements necessary to deliver this in a safe manner when the time comes and when those reactors have been trialled in the offshore environment. And I certainly know my colleagues on the call today will be talking more about those timelines for implementation and also the regulatory aspects, especially around the IMO interfaces, which are also key to the success in that space. So with that, Randall, I'm hoping I'm within time. I'll wrap up and I'll pass on to, I believe it's Mikhail.
Excellent, thank you, Mark. So certainly we heard there that nuclear is not new. This is not a departure starting from scratch from zero. There's a lot that is known, there's a lot of experience there. The SMR element is new, but that in many ways we'll hear more about is likely to be a good thing. And this idea of kind of isolation of a small modular reactor within the vessel in some modular context might be one way of looking at this and may provide some advantages. And as you said at the end, It's important to be able to look at this in a safe manner when the time comes, and that element of when the time comes is something that we'll be exploring a little bit more. So Mikael, you are working on commercializing technology that will come to market and be used specifically for vessel propulsion. So you've been thinking a lot about this, and you've heard, I'm sure, a lot of the tough questions. So maybe over to you to explain a little bit about what is SMR technology in a vessel, what does it mean, and how do we kind of wrap our heads around this? So please, over to you.
Thanks, Randall, and thanks, Mark, for sort of opening this up. I think the first thing that I'd like to say is that there is a huge misconception around the world that safety is the #1 thing that we need to consider when it comes to nuclear, that nuclear somehow is unsafe. Track record of nuclear, civilian nuclear, is almost impeccable. I mean, no one has died or become sick from this since 1986, when we had that accident in the Ukraine. And it has an incredible track record of providing, you know, very long-term, very reliable, utterly green and very safe energy, which we can now use in different ways, and we need to use in different ways as climate change is bearing down upon us. I'd like to make a few points here, though, because there are specific things related to this which are well worth remembering. There is really that perception of nuclear, which is related to what we like to term conventional nuclear, existing nuclear reactor technologies and power plants around the world. Really what we're talking about here is a new generation, not just small modular reactors, which are small versions of the old ones, but really new technologies that solve some of these key issues. And there are really 3 things that we need to solve in order for shipping, or rather for this to be appropriate and fit for purpose in shipping. The first is that we need a new level of fuel efficiency. By having a fuel efficiency that really is at the other end of the spectrum than what we find in conventional nuclear, we can fuel assets for life. It means that we can operate ships for 20, 25, 30 years without refueling them, and we can have floating nuclear power stations providing power to green hydrogen, ammonia, etc., for up to 40 years. And this is significant because that proliferation issue of fuels, getting into the wrong hands is really something that happens during refueling operations, when fresh fuels are put in and spent fuels are taken out the back end of it. The second key sort of criteria for us is that we need to be able to provide a very small area around the reactor where radiation safety matters. In a conventional nuclear reactor, you have very high pressure. You have 150 to 200 bar of pressure. So if there is a leak, you would have the potential expulsion of radiotoxins into the environment. So if, for example, a ship is then in port, you would have to have an emergency preparedness readiness zone, an EPRZ, which is quite large around that ship. By having ambient pressure only in these reactors, that area can be tiny. It can in fact be on the ship and not extend beyond the railings of the ship in port. That makes a big difference when it comes to the comfort level of people working in the port, when these ships are in there. And the third, and I think just as significant, is that because these are very small machines, we have the ability to serial prototype and mass assemble them in a different way than you do with conventional nuclear today, which are all construction projects, which means that we can get the economies of scale, or the economies of numbers really to function for us in such a way that it becomes a very economical and affordable way to do this. What we're talking about in particular is the molten salt reactor, and the one that we're building in the United States with support from the US government together with our partners is a molten chloride fast reactor. It's the first ever liquid-fueled fast spectrum reactor. And we believe what we're seeing so far is that the promise from this machine, it's going to be the most fuel-efficient reactor ever built. It's liquid core, and of course it's small. So it meets all those 3 criteria. The first thing that we think is going to be, where this is going to be deployed, like Mark alluded to, is really on offshore structures. We've got concept designs now up and running for floating power stations where these reactors are deployed on board to provide completely clean energy, which can be then transferred onto refinery type assets, FPSOs, if you like, that would then desalinate water, turn it into hydrogen, capture nitrogen from the air, and then in a Haber-Bosch process, produce green ammonia, completely green ammonia, by the way, at a cost which is the kind of cost that we need in order for this fuel to function. Just to give you an example, 3 cents per kilowatt hour will provide green ammonia at about $1,300 per metric ton, which is sort of bunkers plus carbon pricing, if you like. The current Nord Pool system price, that's the European system price, for the month of February to date is 96 cents, so 84 euros, euro cents, 96 cents, which makes green ammonia ridiculously expensive. So we need to be able to do this at a low cost. We need to be able to do it in a stable and reliable manner. And we believe this is a good way to produce the kind of fuels that the industry is asking for. For the largest ships out there, ammonia and methanol is unlikely, in our opinion, to be a very economic way forward. It's not something that produces the kind of competition or competitive advantages that current diesel fuels and LNG and then of course nuclear can provide. Just to give you an example here, we've got a Newcastle Max bulk carrier, which is sailing on a sort of standard Brazil-Asia round trip of 60 days. With current VLSFO, ULSFO 380, we're using about 3,700 metric tons of bunkers, $750 for that price of fuel this week, plus carbon pricing, of course, it gives you the cost base for it. That produces 11,200 metric tons of carbon dioxide, plus particulates, plus NOx and SOx and other things. Green ammonia, we would have to use nearly 9,000 tons of fuel on the same voyage because of the low energy content of that fuel. And we estimate that the price would be somewhere at in the next few years between 3 and 6 times that of the 380. We won't have any carbon dioxide coming out of it, but we will have NOx because the nitrogen in the hydrogen will mix with oxygen and create NOx. With the molten salt reactor, which has a fuel efficiency of 1 gram per megawatt day, we will consume a total of 1.1 kilos of fissile fuel. The economics, as they have been worked out so far and to date, and the fuel is very expensive here, we're looking at a leasing equivalent of about $450 per metric ton. Of course, immune to carbon pricing and doesn't produce any emissions at all. The final waste product is exactly what we've spent. That's 1.1 kilos, which in the terms of a Newcastle Max bulk carrier with a 25-year life can produce 170 kilos of waste at the end of its life. That's its entire environmental footprint. That's about the size of a shoebox. For the container industry, we believe that there is a more dramatic effect in this. We have a current concept design with some partners in Asia where we're looking at a 20,000 TEU container ship that's been designed to do more than 30 knots and to be able to do that design service speed for over 30 years on a single fuel load. There's a lot of power on this vessel, and she compares then to the current generation of 20,000 TEU container ships in the sense that she goes rather a lot faster and can do this with true zero emission. The transformative nature of this way of doing it is really a shortening in transit times. We get Trans-Pacific, say Busan to Long Beach, down to 6.3 days. We get the Asia-Europe ex-Suez down to just about 3 weeks. That's competitive with Northern Sea Route, it's competitive with trains, and of course it doesn't include Suez Transit. So we believe this is the sort of thing that can put a real competitive advantage back into the market and provide the kind of economic competitive environment that the industry needs to move forward into this. So it's rather different than the way we look at e-fuels, and it's, I think, a positive way forward for the industry. It's particularly aimed at the largest ships. We do not propose to put these on medium-sized or small ships, but really the larger ships. We've proven that 7,300 of the ships in the world fleet consume just about 50% of all the bunkers, and as a result produce about 50% of the pollution that comes from shipping. So if our aim is to do 50% reduction in pollution, air pollution from shipping, here is a perfectly reasonable way to look at it. Take the largest container ships, bulk carriers, gas carriers, cruise ships, even oil tankers, and convert them to this technology that will function so well for this particular market. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Mikael. Very compelling pitch. 30 knots for 30 years obviously is something that's hard to argue with, but we're not quite there yet. So what I'd like to do is, Gwilym, to turn to you to get your perspective on the regulatory side, and how close are we to that? What are the timelines that you see that it might take us to get there?
Thank you. So I think in terms of the regulatory picture, there were probably four things that I particularly wanted to pick up on. First, the kind of bit of regulatory good news is that the IMO, I think as has been mentioned, does have a code around nuclear ships. The less good news is that it was published in 1981. And whilst I celebrated my 40th birthday last year, and I'm keen to say things that are 40 years old are really vital and relevant, the IMO's code has not kept pace with the technology. The type of technology that's being looked at in terms of a new generation of nuclear shipping is different from what the code was written around. But also the whole of the rest of the regulatory regime from IMO has been added to, changed, enhanced over that period of time, and has not kept that piece of specific code up to date in the same way. So there would be a significant revision of what IMO has needed. The other factor is one of the key characteristics of shipping is that it operates with multiple and often overlapping regulatory jurisdictions in terms of the sort of flag state of the vessels, the port states they're operating in, but also the wider issues around the shoreside activity. When we're talking about the life cycle of a vessel, what happens to it after use, the sort of shoreside elements of production and of disposal of any system. So we need to be looking not just at the ship itself, but that wider market. The third thing, kind of as regulators, we not only have to deal with the safety risks, but we also have to deal with the public perception of safety risks. And we shouldn't kind of downplay that element that people's perceptions of risks are an important part of the work of regulators. And it is the challenge that I think Mikael alluded to, that there is a perception around nuclear that it is inherently dangerous. There's lots of reasons why we can counteract that perception, but we have to work with that baseline. We also have to recognise that a lot of the alternative fuels that are being talked about also have significant safety and regulatory challenges. So there may be challenges for nuclear, but if we're talking about ammonia, we're talking about hydrogen. These also come with big safety challenges associated with them. So the picture is it's not as straightforward as perhaps people think for some of those other fuels as well. And then in terms of the timelines, the way that IMO works with its committees and its subcommittees, it will take multiple years for it to work through that process. We would probably think that a significant revision of a code, we'd be talking the best part of a decade in order for IMO to work through that. And I think what's really important for IMO to actually do that effectively is to create the space where it's looking at the technology and at the technical arguments around things. What IMO, when IMO is working well and is at its best, it's a space where you can convene expertise from around the world to deal with those technical issues and try and keep the the small p politics kind of to one side of the IMO discussion, because that often becomes quite a distraction to those things. But we'd be, I think, imagining a sequence of events that would take the best part of a decade in terms of regulatory provision on that international stage. And I think I'll pause there.
Excellent. Thank you, Gwilym. Thank you very much for that. And I think we heard that the public perception of risk is sometimes as important or more important than the actual risk, and it's something that regulators do have to deal with. So that's certainly true. And then a bit of your insights on the IMO and the timelines there, and that it will take the best part of a decade from when those conversations start, and that they haven't started yet, or as you pointed out, haven't been renewed since 1981. Which is, we've discussed, you mentioned, only 40 years young. So thank you very much for that. And thank you to all of our speakers for coming down. I'm going to come back with just a few questions. Mikhail, I'm going to start with you. I'm going to pick up on one of the things that you mentioned in one of your slides was you came up with a leasing equivalent. And so one of the questions on economics related to that, when you say leasing, what are you talking about leasing? Is this leasing a vessel, leasing a propulsion unit? What's the model there, and how do those economics work?
And the way we see it is that, you know, ship owning organizations and charterers, cargo owners, etc., are unlikely to become licensed nuclear operators, and therefore will not be buying these systems. They'll have to be owned by and operated by a duty holder, which is responsible to the regulators and the licensing regime that runs them. It's a rather, you know, it's a departure from the way things work today. It's a sort of a disruptive business model that sits underneath this as well. What we see is vessels built to a very high standard, the highest standard, new designs of vessels that don't have fuel tanks or smokestacks or shaft lines, if you like, with reactors and electrical propulsion systems on board, being owned by an organization, a leasing organization that has the duty holder embedded in it, and then is leased out in the same way that you have with bareboat charters or quasi-hybrid bareboat charters today to those that wish to operate them. So effectively, it emulates the way that the industry works today, with a slight difference in the sense that the ownership of these vessels isn't going to be sitting with independent owners and you know, able to, if you like, move them around the sale and purchase market. Economically, that works out in the sense that you can then fund these vessels for their lifetime. We've got green bond financing now opening up with the EU taxonomy, applying to nuclear to an extent. We see this happening in Canada. Bruce Power launched a $500 million bond, which was oversubscribed. And you know, these are long-term bonds, which could effectively be the lifetime of the ships, 20, 25, 30-year bonds that provide the kind of, you know, flat capital structure, which leasing then sits on top of. So you're really looking at you know, a cost of capital type leasing that goes over time to those that then charter them for the long term. These again can then be linked to long-term cargo contracts, COAs, if you like, where you can then comfortably go into long-term COAs, knowing that there is absolutely no volatility in your cost of propulsion, no need for fuel hedging, no need to reset contracts according to indices, etc. Simply because, you know, there is a flat price down the bottom. These reactors are fueled up front. You pay for the energy up front, and if we can ameliorate that, if you like, that big CAPEX at the front with the leasing structure, that is one way of doing it. And we believe that's going to function really well. Just to Gwilym's point on this thing with regulatory, yes, if you wanted to have this and if you needed to have this instantly going from where we are today into a big global market, I think we would need the IMO to act quickly. But actually, we have the ability here to operate bilaterally under UNCLOS. You can have specific nation states and port states where trade, you know, if you like, industrial carriage, this can be iron ore, it can be energy, it can be foodstuffs, and it can be containers, you know, operating on specific trade lanes, you know, with ships with this technology on board, without it necessarily being approved by the IMO or the broader IMO ecosystem. So I think that's definitely where we start with this.
Thanks, Mikhail, and thanks to everybody who's putting questions in the chat. We'll come back to some of those. I see one there related to the end of life used fuel, and then another one related to the IMO. We'll come back to both of those. But first, Mikael, just back to you on one thing. You said you were talking about cost of electricity, 3 cents per kilowatt hour. If I understand correctly, that's maybe about a third of what current nuclear costs, and this is from smaller reactors. How do you come to that number that that drives your competitive costs?
The cost of conventional nuclear is one that you can't put a number like that on, Randall. It depends really on the age of the plant and how it's depreciated and what goes in there. Here you've got a situation where you're not refueling these, right? So, a conventional nuclear plant needs refueling every 2 years. You're constantly stopping and you're refueling those and taking the fuels out, then either for reprocessing or for storage. So you've got a large component X, the actual power production that gets out of this. Here you've got a small system that is mass manufactured. You've got one fuel that goes in, stays in there for the whole time, and that cost is fixed. So we're looking at, $30 to $40 per megawatt hour, which is really what the aim is here, and we potentially can bring it down below that as well. We don't know exactly where that's going to be at the moment, but I'd like to just juxtapose that with, like I said, the current system price of Nord Pool for the European Union, which is 96 cents per kilowatt hour. So we've got a long way to go from grid power down to there. We also see the most efficient offshore wind at about 140 to 145 dollars per megawatt hour if you take the system cost, not just the LCOE that's calculated off those, but system cost. We think this is competitive and needs to kind of be at that price in order for ammonia to be a cost-effective fuel. And otherwise, it's going to be difficult. You're not going to be able to close that green premium between fossil fuels and ammonia if you don't get to that price, which was really the point I was trying to make.
Okay, thank you very much for that. The numbers I was referring to come from the from EDF for the cost of new nuclear installations at a 40-year life in the UK. So your numbers sound a bit optimistic, but I suppose that you need to be an optimist in terms of what we're setting out to achieve, because it is a very big challenge. And so, Mark, back to you on this. So we've heard about kind of the potential for the economics and where they might get to. There's a chance of competitiveness there, but in order for that to happen, there's a need for the safety and security elements to be under control, and therefore the role of the class societies to make sure that happens. And that's going to need to happen before we can even get into engaging with different stakeholders around getting contracts or looking at what an actual build would be in place. How do we move forward on this? Do class societies need to wait for the IMO to act? Is this something that can be moving already? And what are the timelines from a class society perspective?
Well, thank you for that. I think probably the best and most positive thing to say here is that actually it's already moving. We expect to have the high-level requirements for class rules available by this time next year.
Okay.
And they're likely to lead on other elements for the simple reason there needs to be that view brought into the industry. And in the first instance, I'm sure it will be used and it will be challenged, and that is only right that it should be challenged. And as the regulatory environment evolves, the rules will also evolve as well. So by the time we get the first reactors in the water, and let's postulate that that's maybe 2027, 2028 for the first proof of concepts in the water, we need to have robust rules in place that have been challenged and also integrate with the various regulatory environments around the world. And that's for both the shipping and the offshore sectors for that. So we're actually very buoyant in our view on our ability to do this. And we're also very aware that there needs to be cooperation amongst the various bodies to achieve this as well. Because we understand that if everyone comes up with very different requirements, that will impose big challenges on the industry. So as class societies, whilst we will always have our own view and perception, at the same time, there needs to be a core element which can be clearly understood by the regulators around the world.
So a role for that pre-competitive element in terms of the class societies working together to make sure that there's clarity that regulators can hear. So that, and then great to hear that class rules by this time next year sounds like certainly a step in the right direction. Gwilym.
We can just come back to that very briefly.
Yes, sorry.
That is a Lloyds Register perception.
Yes.
About where we will be, and also our expectation that we will need to be discussing with our friends in other class societies as well. We see that as the way forward.
Okay, not that we will have resolution across class societies by this time next year, but Lloyds Register making progress and the need for the class societies to work together in that context. Gwilym, there was a question in the chat that came in about, given the IMO targets in 2030 and 2050 to reduce emissions, isn't there an imperative to accelerate the pace of passing new regulations for technologies such as nuclear? And if so, why is or isn't this being discussed?
So, I mean, I think the ambition of IMO and the ambition of stakeholders across the sector to see emissions coming down does create a real pressure on the regulatory process and the timelines. I think there is a recognition that we can't hang about on these issues, but equally we need to get them right. So accelerating activity, but then having regulations that are not robust and don't actually deal with the safety issues would clearly be counterproductive. I think one of the opportunities, and it's a little bit picking up on what Mikhail said around some of the early movement on this can be on a point-to-point bilateral basis. Part of the Clydebank Declaration that was made at COP26 in Glasgow was the concept of green corridors. That's not just about nuclear, but actually about a number of the emission reduction technologies that actually looking to enable them on a bilateral basis ahead of the international rules will be one of the ways of getting deployment and certainly getting that experience built of using the technologies, which will then feed into the regulatory process. We also have this kind of chicken and egg scenario that until you develop the technology, we can't write the regulations, but actually until you've got a reasonable regulatory framework in place, you don't have the confidence from investment, etc., to actually scale up the technology. And there will always be a bit of an ongoing dynamic between regulation and technology and feeding between the two of them.
Thank you very much for that. Picking up on the green corridors elements, one of the things that we discussed is, is there a tramp opportunity for nuclear powered shipping, or is this really going to be something that's going to be point to point? And it sounds like it might need to start off with kind of obviously not 1, but 2 points. Is that the way that you see the introduction, Gwilym, from your side?
Certainly, I think it will be the way that things start, because some of that is the public perception issues, the fact that actually you'll need, as regulators, a certain degree of confidence, and the appetite for nuclear, I think, varies quite a lot from around the world. So, yeah, certainly I think the first step will be point to point. I think actually some of the questions, once that experience is built, and particularly this issue of being able to demonstrate that the risks are actually contained on the vessel and do not and would not go beyond the vessel. So even if you did have an incident, it would be contained within the vessel. I think that would then open up a more tramping opportunities. I mean, more of that kind of flexibility more globally.
So that goes back to I think it was called the Nuclear Preparedness Readiness Zone that Mikhail mentioned earlier. Mikhail, you want to come in here?
I think it's worth just adding to a few of Guillem's good points here. That this isn't energy for the short term. This is energy for the long-term future. We're coming to the end of the fossil fuel era at some stage in the next generation, right? I mean, the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years. We've been asked to stop burning biomass, stop burning fossil fuels, stop burning things that emit smoke into the atmosphere. So this is a new generation of technology for the future. It's not something that has to be done by 2030, 2035, 2040, etc. IMO rules will adapt like they always do. What we have to do here is we have to be very specific about the intentions to do something very positive. The first thing is we have to contend with the fact that the ships that would have this technology on board would have to be built to a far superior standard than ships are built today. Not saying that ships aren't built to a good standard, but you're talking a much higher design standard and construction standard, even operational standards for ships. We're also talking about a very different way of operating these ships. So the seafarers, the stakeholders on board the vessels will have to be trained really in regimes that are much more like the ones we find in the Navy than we find in commercial shipping. So we're looking at a real departure from the way things are. You don't need many people on board to operate these things. In fact, they don't need much operation at all. But the ones that are responsible for the assets with the reactors on board really have to be trained at the very highest levels. We're looking at sort of naval thing. The last thing that's important to remember, Randall, this is something that I think everyone should take very, very close note of, is that the liquid-fueled fast reactor in particular is the technology that can consume nuclear waste. One of the public perceptions around nuclear today is related to what about the waste? What are we going to do with this waste? It's very long-lived, et cetera, despite the fact there's very little of it. Here is a technology where you can close that fuel cycle. You can create a waste to energy future where we're taking fuel from spent fuels from conventional nuclear reactors that are on land or other settings and convert that into energy in these liquid fuel fast reactors. And that closing of the fuel cycle is that really last element that says, well, here is a viable way forward, whether we start with 1 or 10 or 20 or 50 ships running in particular trade lanes, whether it then becomes in tramp shipping in the future. It's kind of not really the point at this time. We're not going for a sort of IMO 2020 or Y2K type scenario here where we go from where we are today straight into nuclear. This is a gradual process. And when it happens, it'll be quite an extraordinary thing.
Thanks. So there was a very good question that came through in the chat from Harris Stoker-Fakis, which is around this disruptive business model. So you mentioned very disruptive. Some of those disruptions would include a longer life and would include new training, but I think particularly the biggest disruption would be this idea of an ownership model. And his question was around, isn't this type of new business model more likely to come from external disruptors rather than incumbents? Are today's ship owners ready for this, or is it going to be somebody else who's moving into the shipping domain and saying, well, I'm going to start with propulsion, build a new vessel around it, and come in from the outside completely? What are your thoughts on that?
I think that's a very good point that he's making there. And, Tesla wasn't invented by Ford, and, the iPad wasn't invented by Xerox, and we all know the stories. We are those disruptors. We are coming, despite the fact that we've come from inside the industry, the technology comes from outside, and I think the models come from outside. I think that's right. At the same time, it's not as if, entirely disrupted organizations are going to start, carrying cargoes for charterers. It's going to have that maritime element in there. I do think we're going to see an evolvement of the business model. I see a far greater opportunity here for interesting things like despite the fact that you've got clean shipping, you now also have the ability to power ships in power ports from ships. So instead of having cold ironing, we now have reverse cold ironing. Why not? I mean, the ship is a power station. You have that ability for that technology to spread through the value chain up on the origination side and on the destination side of these value chains. And that transformation of the value chain to the point where you can start actually moving some of the processes onto the water. So you're cleaning up the land environment, creating better environments for humans on land, and using clean energy at sea to produce a much more efficient distribution system of commodities, industrial components, and durable consumer goods, I think is actually what this is all about. It's not just about not releasing CO2 into the atmosphere.
One other question, Michael, just to keep you in the spotlight for a minute. There was a question from Shane Balani around you said 30 knots for 30 years, and their question was, is it correct to assume that the cost scales not with energy consumed, that fuel is only a very small part, but with the power output, which scales to velocity cubed? And they suggest this might be due to the growing footprint of the reactor and cooling systems, in which case, why would the vessel be sailing at 30 knots rather than kind of a more conventional 16 to 24? Is the price of sailing at 30 knots too high? Is that just optimistic, or is that something that realistically would be possible, or is it something that you could actually go even longer or go even more if you're or have more cargo room if you're more modest in the speeds you're approaching?
I think that's an excellent question. It masks a very important choice that has to be made by those that are going to be using these ships. What we wanted to do was to show that it was possible, what it would take for this to be possible. Here you have, 400-meter long ship, one of the largest type container ships in the world that would be able to sustain a design service speed of 30 knots for its entire lifetime of 30 years. That's just not something that we can do today without incredible amounts of fossil fuels on board. And the fact that this is done with a single system, despite the fact that you're going to need a number of reactors in order to achieve this, is really a demonstration of the possibility. Whether you would want to do that, whether it is economically necessary in your trade, whether it's something that you would feel is a competitive advantage or not, is something to be discovered. I mean, we see a great opportunity here for some of the smaller ships, talking sort of Panamaxes up to 6,000-7,000 TEUs, where you have the possibility to operate an entire system with fewer ships. And you could potentially provide a much more efficient scheduling service around that than you do, as things are today. Quick transits, spending time in port, quick transits, spending time in port, and then providing the benefits in those ports from clean energy and the reverse cold ironing that can happen is another thing that adds to it. The economics of a 30 knots for 30 years container ship really has to come through the value chain rather than in ship operation, I think.
That makes a lot of sense. Thanks everybody who's putting their questions in the chat. This is very useful, helps keep the conversation flowing. I've got one more, which is we've discussed a little bit on the kind of corridors element of this. And we've also discussed a little bit about some of the regulators and governments that are providing more interest. And maybe I'll start with you, Willem, but where are the geographies where you see this potentially starting? What are the governments that are positive and kind of pushing in this direction that would be more receptive? So where do you see potentially the different ends of those corridors? And then we'll go around on this one, because I'd be curious on everybody's viewpoints.
I actually think there's probably not many governments have really shown their hand on this one. So it is quite difficult at the moment to sort of predict where those corridors would likely be. I think one of the things we might well see is, because of the fuel densities of other technologies, those are generally going to end up being short sea, certainly in the first instance. Whereas the fact that nuclear is probably certainly in the one that actually really opens up some of the longer distance corridors. So I think, those bits of transatlantic, trans-Pacific corridors are probably where you start with those. Which probably means the US needs to be a player in any corridor that was going to be looked at seriously. But that's probably a bit of a vague question, but I think there's not enough.
No, it's very fair. We can't necessarily see or write the future, but it's just worth opening up and getting your thoughts. Mark?
Yeah, I agree with Willem's position there. The only thing I'll add to it is I think possibly the first deployment of floating reactors could be the offshore industry. And again, that's based around their energy density. And the production of clean fuels requires a huge amount of energy. And this provides a very compact source. It's simpler to deploy from a regulatory perspective because you're in a much more localized area. And of course, what happens in the offshore industry does on occasion filter back through to the maritime industry. And I think it may well be that we see this first experience gained, public perception gained about how it's performing, and then we might see more adoption and more interest on a global basis.
Thanks, Mark. And Mikhail, that makes a nice segue to you. In one of your slides, you had an illustrative example of what an offshore generation might look like. And as I recall, you released a report about 2 weeks ago on this topic. Do you think that this will happen sooner than on vessels themselves? Is this something of a transition to test the technology in a maritime environment while learning about it and while avoiding perhaps some of the closer to shore regulatory hurdles?
Yes, I think that's right, Randall. I don't think it's necessarily a transition from one to the other. I think these are two parallel tracks because you're going to need them both. The sort of floating power production system enables shipyard construction, which is efficient, which is lower cost, and which we can then drag into place into the location where it is. No site preparation is required in an offshore environment. That is likely, I think, to be deployed first in those countries where the primary regulators, the nuclear regulators, this technology, remember, is being developed in the United States, so it's going to be the US authorities that are going to be the first to license this. It's likely then to be a demonstration in US waters on how green hydrogen, electric power from sea, and in the offshore industry can really start to transform, coastal communities and some of those offshore industries, providing, of course, green fuels to shipping and green corridors as well. The next stage, although I don't think it's a transition stage where you then abandon offshore power and then move on to propulsion. I think it's a natural evolution from it. And I think that's really is also an extension of that jurisdiction. So now you've got the US, you've got the friendly allies of the US, like the UK, you've got Japan, you've got France, you've got other countries which are close to the US in terms of nuclear activities and regulation, where you've got that extension of the flag. So you can imagine a US flagged vessel, which is still US territory, still operating under license for US nuclear and maritime regulators. Same with UK flagged vessels, Japanese flagged vessels, etc. So you've got this, if you like, that sort of technological advantage to take back some of that maritime dominance that was lost a long time ago. Part of the natural ebb and flow of competition globally, I think, and that's really where we see this. We see this as sort of America-centric with its friends and allies around it, UK, France, Japan, really being the first jurisdictions to adopt this.
Thanks, Mikhail. So very much a constellation that likely starts with the US. You say the US government's already supporting this, going out to their nuclear allies. One interesting thing to pick up on is you mentioned the flagging. I mean, the flagging of vessels has been an important opportunity for a lot of different countries. And I think I'm hearing you suggest that there might be in some ways a reversal back towards kind of the larger economic powers for that flagging in terms of probably control and safety and security. Is that what you see might end up taking place, a bit of an opposite direction in some ways, but kind of bringing things back towards some of the current nuclear powers as having more vessels, or specifically these vessels, flagged under their name?
Yes, I think so, Randall. And you remember there is a great incentive for this to happen as well. The UK flag is now below 10 million gross registered tons, one of the smallest it's ever been. The US flag is shrinking on a yearly basis. There is an incentive and an interest, not just from government, from the maritime sectors in these countries to rebuild that, and to rebuild that purely on the basis of price by competing with with other flags just to make them cheaper is really not a viable way forward. Here is a way that you could create, if you like, a boost, the kryptonite required, if you like, in those maritime clusters with the flag at the center, where you now have a growing number of young people choosing that as a profession, and where you've got a well qualified, highly paid and motivated workforce that could go out and join this. You've got that engineering, you've got the insurance, you've got the broking and the banking and the classification, everything that comes with it. I mean, we see it as a real opportunity to build back better, as they call it, both here and in the US and other places where you can really, boost the maritime sector through this type of technology. It's been done before.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mikael. So as we're approaching the end, I just wanted to maybe turn to each of you for a minute or so in terms of the key enabler that would allow things to move forward on this. And we've heard a lot of different, we've heard about a lot of different barriers. We've heard about a few enablers, but just kind of paint this in the light of the enabler side. We'll go Mark, then Mikael, then Willem for 1 minute. Mark, to you.
Thank you.
What's the enabler to make this move?
I think the one thing that really will enable this is a degree of collaboration and cooperation, especially around the development of standards, rules, and regulatory requirements. They have to be in sync with each other, certainly in the core and key locations and jurisdictions where this is likely to occur. There seems to be a willingness for that in most of the discussions we have as well. So the next 12 months are indeed going to be interesting. Thank you.
Thanks. Mikael, what's the enabler that you need to see?
I think the biggest enabler, Randall, is demonstration. I mean, we're working, solidly to a demonstration program where this is actually shown to be what it's supposed to be. And I think that's the first thing. Once the first machines are up and running, people can come and see them. They can see what they do and see that this is really, quite an extraordinary technology. Then I think things change substantially. I think the other thing is, it's not so much an enabler. It's something that I think we all have to think a little bit about is, our attitude towards what happens in the future. We've got this climate change, global warming issue that we need to somehow solve. Let's not be ideological about how we do that. Let's be practical. Let's remember that physics is physics, chemistry is chemistry, and mathematics are mathematics. We cannot change the first principles of nature. We cannot make something that's inefficient by nature more, efficient by nature. And similarly, we can take things that we think are or have been told are dangerous or somehow nefarious, and you have to remember why we've been told that, and look at it again. So I think everyone should open their minds and think about nuclear in different ways. Start learning, start reading, start figuring out what's really behind all this. And I think people will be very positively surprised at the benefits that can come from this. This is not a nefarious scheme. This is a brilliant long-term thing for humankind.
Thanks, Mikael. So demonstrations, and then probably even before the demonstrations are in parallel, opening up the minds, an opportunity for learning across the board. Willem, to you, what's the enabler that you see?
I think I probably am very much echoing what Mikael just said. I think it is that bit that when you start to look seriously at nuclear as a contender for this, the challenges associated with it are actually no greater than any of the other emission reduction options. Now, that may sound like it's a bit of a backhanded compliment, but actually I think it is part of that thing of going, whatever emission reduction options we look at, there is going to be disruption in the market. There's going to be regulatory challenges. There's going to be question marks about safety. And actually nuclear becomes one of that suite of options and becomes part of the solution. There's no one size fits all solution to our emission reductions across the fleet and across the economies. We need a mix of solutions, and this will be one of those.
Thank you, Gwilym. I think that's a great final comment. We definitely need a mix of solutions. We're going to need the methanols, the ammonias, the biofuels, and everything else that we can. The ones that are ready now are soon to be ready. We're also going to need, in terms of the learning around this, we're going to need additional transparency around the costs going down to component level. What do things look like? How do we compare apples and oranges? It's really difficult. Nuclear is definitely a different technology than what we're used to seeing. It makes it difficult to wrap your head around how does that compare with something like incumbent technologies or even ammonia for that matter. But we also heard that there is an opportunity where nuclear actually enables some of these other ones. So the offshore enabling of scalable zero emission fuels is something where it may be that a broad suite of options is enabled by this. So you're enabling both your production of methanol and your production of ammonia and your uptake, but also enabling this proof point for nuclear technology. So we see here, and thank you very much to our panelists, that nuclear is very interesting. It has a lot of potential, and that it still is not quite there yet. And we have a bit of time ahead of us from a regulatory perspective before we get there. But in the meantime, it's great to have the education, to have the conversation. And with that, I'd like to thank Mark Tipping, Global Power Index Director at Lloyds Register, Michael Bowe, CEO of Core Power, Willem Stone, Assistant Director, Ship Standards at UK Maritime and Coast Guard Agencies. We're at the top of the hour. Thanks to everyone who joined us. As mentioned earlier, this session has been recorded. The recording will be made available on the Global Maritime Forum website, usually within 24 hours. And then over the coming months, we'll pull this into a briefing document as well. So thank you to our panelists for a great conversation. Thank you to everyone who placed your questions in the chat and who joined this conversation. Thanks all.